Good morning, Berthold, and welcome to Rochester, New York. Shall we start with your experiences in Offenbach? It's my understanding that you were born in Offenbach, and so you were perhaps the only citizen of Offenbach who was a member of the very famous Offenbacher Werkstatt. Could you elaborate on that for us?
I was born in Offenbach in 1905, and I left school in 1924, and then I started to work at with Rudolf Koch. Actually, I had met Rudolf Koch before, whilst I was still at school, and he advised me and encouraged me to learn a craft. As a matter of fact, I was apprenticed to a metal foundry in Frankfurt, and learned the same craft Rudolf Koch had learned when he was a young man. That is the craft of metal chasing. But in that foundry all sorts of other work was done, and I also learned to raise vessels from sheet metal.
Yes.
Did a kind of coppersmith work, silversmith work, and so on. But during that time of that apprenticeship, I also went to the art school at Offenbach, to Rudolf Koch's lettering classes. And eventually, I went also to other towns and learned more about metalwork, like silversmithing and setting of stones and enameling. But eventually I became Rudolf Koch's assistant. That was in 1929, when Heinrichsen, who was at that time Rudolf Koch's assistant, had gone to Hanover.
I see.
Of course, Fritz Gredl worked also in the Werkstatt, and that was a very interesting place. There were lots of several pupils of Koch's. A selected group of pupils of Koch worked there, and the activities consisted of lettering, pen lettering drawn, also wood engraving, in which Fritz Gredl, of course, was a great master.
Yes. Well, I understand that Warren Chappell, the American, attended the Werkstatt from about 1929 to 1930. Am I correct about that?
That's right, yes. He came for 1 year, and with his wife,
Lydia. Yes. Now, Fritz, of course, was associated with Rudolf Koch some years before you, I understand. And of course, he cut the beautiful wood engravings
for the Book of Flowers.
The Book of Flowers, Das Blumenbuch. We have, of course, one of the edition of 20 copies on proof paper. That one has a title page by you.
Yes.
Could you tell us about that?
Well, Rudolf Koch asked me to do a title page for this, so I took a piece of paper and I didn't rule it, and I wrote very quickly this title and all the facts which are required on this sheet of paper, which I considered rough, and I showed it to Rudolf Koch, and he said, "That's fine, don't do it again. We'll ask Fritz to have it cut on wood," and that's how this title page was done.
It's a beautiful page. Could you tell us something about that very famous map of Germany? I don't believe you know that we have a copy of that. As a matter of fact, I think you'll be somewhat surprised at the amount of work that we have of yours done at Offenbach.
Well, it was just with the Book of Flowers. Rudolf Koch tried to buy a Book of Flowers to show to his children, but he couldn't find a decent one. So he thought, all right, I make one, and eventually he produced the Book of Flowers, and the same happened with the map. He wanted a decent map, and he couldn't find one. And of course, this map is much more decorative than just a map.
Yes,
It becomes more. It's more of a pictorial map. And well, I did this compass rose for it.
Yes.
The main work of the map was done by Fritz Gredel. Rudolf Koch did some of the lettering and the heraldic part.
Yes. Yes. It's a beautiful production. How was it printed? I mean, how many blocks were used?
Originally, Fritz Gredel cut the map on cut pieces on wood, but eventually it was all done in drawings. First, there were all different stages,
Yes.
like line blocks, but eventually it was printed lithographically.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
And then it was hand painted.
It was
hand colored.
colored, but
Yes.
it was all reproduced in lithography eventually.
Yes. Now, it's my understanding that your first typeface, Hyperion, was done at about this time, 1931 or about that time?
Yes. Well, Paul Koch had come back from Florence, where he had worked with Victor Hammer for many years, had come back to Offenbach, and we were friends, and we decided to produce a type which could be used for printing of songs or any kind of sort of special work. And so Paul Koch cut one size,
And
following my my drawings.
yes. What was its first use? Do you recall?
Then the Bauer type foundry got interested and took it over and cut all the other sizes. I think the first use probably was in those two little books of mine, Handwerker Zeichen and Marken und Schmuckstücke, the book of decorative pieces
Yes.
and marks and trademarks.
Yes. Yes. Well, did Rudolf know about your?
Yes,
Your
Rudolf Koch
design? Okay.
knew about
He-
that, yes, of course. And
He
he approved of it.
good.
Yes.
Good. Good. Now, at about the same time, it's my understanding that you made a trip, perhaps a holiday, to England, and you met Stanley
Yes,
Morrison.
the,
at that
the,
time.
the year or two before, Rudolf Koch had gone to London and gave a talk to the Double Crown Club, and he met various people. And when I went over to London in the summer of 1932, Rudolf Koch asked me to visit some of those people he had met previously. So I met Oliver Simon, Francis Mennel, Harold Curwen, and Stanley Morrison. Stanley Morrison had seen some inscriptions on bronze of mine, which had been photographed and reproduced in some journals. And when I met him, he commissioned me to design a type based on that style of lettering used on those bronze inscriptions.
Yes. And
Just as he had asked Eric Gill to design a type based on Eric Gill's stone inscriptions,
yes.
which were incised on stone, but actually the bronze inscriptions of mine had the background cut back, so the letters actually were already had a metal surface, just
Yes,
like
it
a
was
printing
raised.
type.
The letters were raised.
Yeah.
Well, of course, this is the story of the birth of one of the world's great typefaces, Albertus. I take it that it was cut by the Monotype Corporation in about 1932 or so, and
Well, it was cut in about about that time, 1934,
1934, yes.
And it was first shown on the cover of a book number of the monotype recorder in the
yes.
spring of 1935.
Right, we have that. And then, of course, the demand was very good for Albertus, and so other weights were cut later.
Yes, and a lowercase.
And a lowercase, yes.
A bold version of the titling
Mm-hmm.
and light
Yes.
version of the upper and lowercase.
Right. I think the lowercase is exceedingly beautiful, and it's not used as often as it should be.
That's
but-
very nice of you to see.
But we do see here in America the caps used more and more frequently. Now, what about your other typefaces for English Monotype Corporation?
There is a black letter type,
The Saxon Wall.
a Saxonwald,
Mhm.
which was designed and cut in about 1937, and which we used at the Fanfare press quite successfully for an edition of Omar Khayyam with with Albertus capitals. It looks quite nice.
Yes.
There was another type which I did for the Fanfare press, which was cut by monotype, but only for the use of Fanfare, which is called Tempest.
Yes.
It's a sloping kind of sans serif type of a certain urgency,
Right.
which was used by the Fanfare press for jackets, particularly for Golan's jackets.
Yes. That's a very handsome sort of a brush developed letter, would you say?
Yes, well, brush or pen, yes.
Brush or pen?
Yes.
Okay, well, now, speaking of Fanfare Press, once you decided to leave Germany, and I don't know whether or not you would like to expound upon that, but at any rate, you began a term of employment with Ernest Ingham at Fanfare.
Yes.
Could you tell us about that?
Well, I left Germany in 1935 and came to England for good in that year. And Ernest Ingham gave me a lot of work. I designed lots of book jackets for Golan's, and also this type Tempest already mentioned.
Yes.
But also I designed a series of type ornaments which were published in book form in the January of 1939, and they were really in a way a new departure. They were not historic flowers,
Yes.
fleurons, but
Well, we have
more of a contemporary style, and they're
Right.
perhaps connected in their design with some of the goldsmith's work I had done a few years earlier.
I understand.
I'm sorry, you were going to say
Well,
something.
no, I was going to merely mention that I have not seen a copy of that book with the ornaments, but we do have a copy of the Fanfare Press specimen book, and we have the ornaments shown there. So
Yes.
they're on display in the Carey collection right now. Now, Tempest, what year was it that you actually designed the Tempest? Did it start as a full-blown alphabet, or merely as some lettering for one particular
Well,
purpose?
I had done a drawing for a book jacket. The title of that book was The Pursuer, and therefore I did some lettering which had a sort of a certain urgency about it,
Yes.
according to the meaning of the title. And that was considered by buying them as a good base for a type. And actually it's quite interesting. First I did drawings and we made line blocks and stuck letters together and used them on jackets, but eventually we found it most useful to have it cut, and so it was cut in 2 or 3 sizes.
Yes. This is a little bit off the proper path, but I'm going to ask you about Frederic Ward. Did you ever meet him?
I only met him once, I think, it was in Frankfurt, together with Rudolf Koch and Victor Hammer.
Ah, with Victor Hammer.
And we had a meal together, and it was most pleasant, and I found him
I
a
understand
very
he was
interesting person.
Very interesting. Somewhat difficult to work with.
I don't know about that.
Yeah, because you didn't really work with him.
No, right.
Okay. That was really in the way of an aside.
Yes.
Let's get back to the Berthold Wolpe story. When did you make your connection with Faber and Faber?
That was in 1941, when I started to work for Rich de la Mer, who was the production director of Faber's. A remarkable man who produced some very fine books in the late 20s and 30s. I'm talking only about the typographic style of those books.
Yes.
I'm not talking about the literary contents, of course. They were probably good books in other ways as well. And of course, Faber and Faber's had amongst the directors also T.S. Eliot, who
well, he was an editor there.
He was what you might call him the editor of the poetry books.
Yes.
And I did many jackets for poetry books, which I always showed to him. It was always interesting to have his comments.
Yes. Well, what about, well, I do recall that when I was in London that you did introduce me to his widow. Is she still there at Faber and Faber?
No, she doesn't work there, but she may be in New York at the moment where they
really?
produce the cats.
I see.
Yeah.
I see. Okay. What about Mitchell Kennelly's son? I've forgotten his first name.
Morley Kennelly.
Morley Kennelly.
Yes.
Kennelly, right.
Well,
he was also in production.
No, he was not in production, but he was one of the directors of Faber and Faber.
Of course. Okay, yes.
I will tell you more about a certain event tomorrow.
Oh, okay. You don't want to relate it for our audience here today. We only have a very small audience for this.
Right, I tell you the story.
Taping. Yes.
Morley Kennelly came to me one day and said, "Here I got something I found amongst the belongings of my father. It's a set of razors which belonged to Goudy." And he showed me this red leather case which had 7 razors in it. And on the case outside it said F.W. Goudy, blocked in gold Gothic letters. And he said to me, "Goudy was a type designer and you were a type designer. You ought to have Goudy's razors." So he gave them to me, and I put them in the drawer of my desk. Now, nothing happened to the razors for some time, till a colleague of mine came up and said to me, "I asked you some time ago to design a bookplate for me, and you never done it. Will you please swear on Goudy's razors that you will do it within a fortnight?"
Right.
So I got out Goudy's razors, put my hand on it, and I swore I would do it within a fortnight. And I did. That's the only use I ever made of Goudy's razors.
Goudy's razors, I don't blame you. Well, we're going to make this a rather short taping session, so I'd like to throw out a few names and get your reactions to the personalities. Stanley Morrison, for instance, as a person.
He was a remarkable man in many ways, and it's needless to say.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very difficult to summarize him, but I met him very often, and of course, as he commissioned work for me, I was in touch with him at various times. He was what shall I say? He was a pleasant character. I mean,
Okay.
I mean,
That's
it's
fine.
impossible to.
Yes.
To,
Oh,
who
I
had many
understand
sides
that.
to his.
I understand that.
Character.
What about Alfred Fairbank, your friend who died just recently?
I met Alfred Fairbank in 1935, and we used to meet in lunch hours. Alfred worked at the Admiralty in Whitehall, and we used to go to St. James's Park and have our sandwiches,
Oh, yes.
and talked about lettering and about this and that. And eventually we did a book together on Renaissance handwriting, where we selected the plates together. He wrote the introduction, I wrote notes
Yes.
about individual plates.
Yes, that's a wonderful book. We'll talk more about your writings in a minute. What about Bruce Rogers?
I was introduced to Bruce Rogers when Bruce Rogers was in London at the opening of the 50 Books of the Year exhibition, which must have been in the autumn of 1935.
Yes. Yes, that was perhaps the last time that Rogers was in England for an extended stay. I mean,
Yes.
he visited it off and on after that time, but that was about the end of his periodic stays in England, extended stays. This was right after the publication of the Lectern Bible.
Yes.
A marvelous book.
Splendid book, yes.
Yes. Now, Eric Gill.
I only met Eric Gill once after a lecture, when Charles Pennew showed his film about the Roman letter.
I've never seen that film.
And you ought to get hold of it for your students. It's
Okay,
quite
fine.
interesting.
Well, what about David Kindersley? He's a friend of yours, I understand.
Well, David Kindersley lives in Cambridge, so I don't see him very often,
Mhm.
but I know him.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yes. Well, let's talk about some Americans. Joe Blumenthal. Did you know him when he was in Germany?
No.
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 But it is quite possible that
He stayed in Germany for a short time when his type was cut,
yes,
wasn't it?
that's right. He
Yeah.
was in Weimar at the Bremer Presse.
I
Is
didn't know that.
Right, yes. Well, he wasn't really affiliated with them, but
Yeah.
they printed his proofs for him and did other miscellaneous work. The punch cutter for Blumenthal's spiral type was...
The Emerson type.
Well, the Emerson type,
Yes,
yes. Well, he likes to make a distinction now
Yes.
between spiral type and Emerson type. Spiral being the foundry version cut by Bauer Type Foundry.
Yes.
Louis Hurl or Whirl.
Yes.
I'm probably doing a lousy job of
No, no.
pronunciation. And the monotype version, which was cut under Stanley Morrison's
Kind of,
auspices,
yes.
and that Blumenthal prefers to call Emerson.
Yeah.
But you didn't meet him during his
No.
period of time, okay?
No, I met
thought
him.
maybe you might have run across him at
No,
Bowers.
I
Typography.
met him in London.
Mhm.
I don't know, in the early 50s, I think.
I see.
Yeah.
Right. Well, let's sort of sum up by letting you have a few words about what you're doing now, your teaching in London, and your brief trip here to the United States.
Well, I taught at Camberwell School of Art many years ago, and then I was a tutor at the Royal College of Art, and later a visiting lecturer there, and now I'm still teaching at the City and Guilds of London Art School,
Yes.
and I teach lettering there, and they got a lettering course, which is
Well, you're also an RDI, Royal Designer for Industry. When were you given this prestigious award?
I think it must have been in 1958. I'm not quite certain.
Right. It's wonderful. And then your doctorate came from the Royal College of Art. Am I correct?
That's right.
Yes.
And well, I had edited some writing book for the Lion Unicorn Press, which was the private press of the Royal College of Art.
Yes.
But I got involved with other searches or researches, and I have given the Lyle lectures this spring
Yes, at Oxford University. Yes.
which is all about Elizabethan calligraphy and printmaking.
Yes. Well, you are also the author of one of my favorite books, as I told you last evening, the facsimile edition of the Figgins type specimen book, which was issued by Printing Historical Society while you were its chairman. Maybe you would like to tell us more about your researches into type founders and type designers.
Well, perhaps through teaching, I got interested in the past activities of type designers and type founders. I mean, it doesn't really matter whether the type is designed this year or whether it designed 500 years ago. If it's a good type, it may still have some meaning.
Yes.
As we still use Roman capitals, which are nearly 2,000 years old and are still quite modern or useful.
True enough.
So through teaching and showing the development of letter form, I got really into this kind of research. And whenever I came across something which was little known, I tried to make it better known and
Yes.
find out more about it.
Well, you did a really remarkable job with the Figgins. I think it's really a magnificent book, beautifully printed, a wonderful introduction, and I wish you would issue more of them. Now, can I make this sort of the last question?
Yeah.
At Offenbach, I would imagine that you must have met Melbert Carey on occasion.
I met Melbert Carey, and I remember it well, and he asked me to design a device for a golf club which he was connected with. I think it was called the Millbrook
Oh, yes.
Golf Club.
Yes, Millbrook.
Yeah.
And did you do that?
I did one or two drawings for that, yes.
Yes, yes.
I doubt that they were used.
I see.
But,
I see.
yeah.
Well, as a personality, do you think you knew him well enough to make any comments?
No,
Or
I
really, you know,
met him only rather fleetingly, you know, when
Yes.
he came and visited Rudolf Koch and the Werkstatt.
Right, right. But of course, you do know that he imported types from Europe into
Yes.
the United States.
And I think he was also the man who probably suggested to Warren Chappell that he should come to Offenbach.
It is quite possible,
Yeah.
yes, yes. Well, good. Thank you very much, Dr. Wolpe. We really appreciate your taking the time to spend a few minutes with us, and I'd like to thank also your wife, Margaret, for being extremely patient while we were making this
Well,
videotape.
I'm delighted to be here and feel much honored. Thank you very much,
It's our pleasure.
Professor Herbert Johnson.